You gave Jason my college fund, didn't you? Emily Carter asked quietly at the dinner table, and the silence that followed felt heavier than any answer her parents could have given. No one spoke. Her father stared down at his plate, slowly cutting into a steak as if the question had never been asked. Her mother's smile stiffened for a moment before she reached for her water glass. Jason, sitting across the table, suddenly seemed fascinated by his phone. In that small suburban dining room outside Columbus, Ohio, the air felt strangely tight, as if something invisible had been exposed. Emily hadn't planned to say those words that night. The question had slipped out before she could stop it, triggered by a single careless sentence Jason had made earlier in the evening. He had been laughing about his college days, talking about how lucky he'd been to graduate without any debt. Good thing Mom and Dad had that college fund ready, he had said casually. At first Emily had smiled politely, assuming he meant something else. But the words kept echoing in her mind. College fund. The phrase didn't belong to Jason. Growing up, Emily had always believed there simply wasn't money for something like that. She remembered long conversations about financial aid forms, late-night shifts at a grocery store during her senior year of high school, and the stack of student loan papers she had signed when she turned 18. Her parents had always said the same thing. College was important, but everyone had to work for it. Emily had believed them. She had believed them when she packed her car and drove 8 hours to the University of Missouri with 2 suitcases and a borrowed laptop. She had believed them when she waited tables during weekends just to cover textbooks that sometimes cost more than $200 each. And she had believed them when she graduated with a diploma and a loan balance that would probably follow her for the next 20 years. But tonight, Jason had spoken about a college fund as if it had always existed. As if it had been waiting there all along. Emily looked around the table again. Her parents still hadn't answered her question. That silence told her more than any explanation ever could. Robert Carter finally cleared his throat. Emily, he said slowly, this isn't really the time to get into complicated family finances. Complicated. The word landed heavily. Emily folded her hands in her lap to keep them from shaking. Across from her, Jason shifted in his chair. He looked uncomfortable now, like someone who had just realized he had said something he wasn't supposed to. But it was already too late. The truth had slipped into the room, and it wasn't going anywhere. Emily glanced toward the hallway where an old framed photograph hung on the wall. It showed her at 8 years old, standing between her parents and her grandmother Margaret Carter at a county fair. Emily remembered that day clearly. Her grandmother had bought her cotton candy and told her she was going to do big things someday. At the time, Emily had believed her completely. Back then, the future had felt wide open. Now, sitting at the dinner table more than a decade later, Emily felt something inside her begin to shift. Because if a college fund had existed, and if it had never reached her, then the story she had believed about her life might not be true at all. And somewhere in the quiet spaces of that house, a much larger truth was waiting to be uncovered. The rest of the dinner passed in a strange quiet that no one at the table seemed willing to acknowledge. Emily Carter finished the food on her plate slowly, although she could not remember tasting any of it. Her father spoke once or twice about the weather and a minor repair needed on the garage door, as if nothing unusual had happened. Her mother nodded politely and added small comments about errands for the weekend. Jason kept looking at his phone and occasionally forced a laugh at something on the screen. But the question Emily had asked remained in the air, unaddressed and impossible to forget. Later that night, Emily drove back to her small apartment on the north side of Columbus. The drive took about 20 minutes, passing quiet neighborhoods and the same gas station where she often stopped for coffee before her morning shift at the marketing office, where she worked as a junior assistant. The apartment complex was modest but clean, a 2-story building with narrow balconies and parking spaces that were always too tight. Emily climbed the stairs to her unit and unlocked the door. The room inside was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator. Her kitchen table was covered with paperwork she had been sorting earlier that afternoon. Loan statements, payment reminders, and a small calculator sat beside a notebook where she tracked every dollar she spent. Emily sat down and stared at the numbers again. Her current student loan balance was just over $84,000. She had been making steady payments for 2 years now, sending nearly $700 each month. Sometimes she wondered how long it would take before the balance finally began to shrink in a way she could actually see. Her parents had always said this was simply part of becoming an adult. Everyone struggled in the beginning. Everyone worked their way forward step by step. Emily had accepted that explanation without question. She had always believed her parents were doing the best they could. Her father had worked for a regional construction company for most of his life. Her mother had managed a dental office across town. They were comfortable but never extravagant. Vacations were short road trips to nearby lakes in Michigan or Tennessee. Christmas presents were thoughtful but modest. Emily remembered hearing conversations about budgeting, about saving carefully, about planning for the future. That was why Jason's comment at dinner felt so unsettling. Because if there had truly been a college fund, then the story Emily had believed about her family finances did not make sense anymore. She leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes, trying to remember the earliest time she had heard the phrase college fund. Slowly, a memory surfaced from when she was about 12 years old. She had been sitting at the kitchen counter doing homework when her grandmother Margaret Carter stopped by for a visit. Margaret had brought a box of blueberry muffins from a bakery downtown. Emily could still picture the way her grandmother smiled while placing the box on the counter and saying that she hoped Emily was studying hard because someday college would open many doors for her. At the time, Emily had laughed and said she hoped so too. Then her grandmother had glanced toward Robert and Linda in a way Emily did not fully understand back then and said quietly that it was good her future had already been prepared for. Emily opened her eyes again. Prepared for. The words now felt different than they had all those years ago. Because if that preparation had existed, then somewhere along the way something must have changed. Something that no one had bothered to explain to her. Emily reached for her laptop and opened it, typing slowly into the search bar for the financial website she used to manage her loan payments. The screen lit up with familiar numbers and payment schedules. For a moment she simply stared at the balance again. Then she whispered quietly to the empty apartment, not as a question, but as a realization that was beginning to take shape. If there really had been a college fund with her name attached to it, then someone had made a decision about that money. And whoever made that decision had never told her the truth. The next morning, Emily Carter woke earlier than usual, long before the sun had fully risen over the quiet streets outside her apartment complex. The room still held the pale blue light of early dawn as she sat at the small kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had already grown cold. She had barely slept. The thought that had taken root the night before had refused to leave her mind. If a college fund had truly existed in her name, then it meant that at some point someone had opened an account for her future. That kind of decision did not happen by accident. It required planning, paperwork, and years of contributions. It meant someone had once believed that Emily Carter deserved the same opportunity that many parents hoped to give their children. Yet somehow she had reached adulthood believing that no such help had ever existed. The more she thought about it, the more certain she became that there had been small signs along the way. Moments that had once seemed harmless, but now felt different when she looked at them again. Emily opened her laptop and began searching through old email archives, trying to remember if any financial documents had ever been sent to her when she turned 18. There was nothing. Just scholarship confirmations, loan agreements, and the standard university billing statements that had arrived every semester. Still, Jason's comment from the dinner table continued echoing in her thoughts. Good thing Mom and Dad had that college fund ready. The way he had said it sounded natural, almost casual, as if it had always been understood in their family. Emily stood and walked to the narrow window above her kitchen sink. Outside, a delivery truck was slowly backing into a space near the building across the lot. Life around her seemed ordinary, but something inside her felt unsettled in a way she could not ignore anymore. She picked up her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found Jason's number. For a moment she hesitated. Jason had always been easy to talk to when they were younger. He used to drive her to soccer practice when their parents were busy and once helped her build a science project volcano in the garage. But over the years their conversations had grown shorter. Jason had finished college, started working for a technology company in Cleveland, and rarely visited home except during holidays. Emily pressed the call button before she could change her mind. The phone rang 3 times before Jason answered. His voice sounded relaxed, almost cheerful. He greeted her the way he always did, asking if everything was going well at work. Emily listened politely for a moment before finally asking the question that had been forming since the night before. She asked him what he had meant when he talked about a college fund during dinner. Jason paused for a few seconds. It was not a long silence, but it was enough for Emily to notice. Then he said something that made her stomach tighten. He said he thought she already knew about it. According to Jason, their parents had mentioned the fund many times when they were growing up. He said it had been something their grandmother Margaret had helped set up years earlier. Emily felt the room grow quiet around her. She explained slowly that no one had ever told her anything about a fund in her name. Jason seemed genuinely confused. He said that when he left for college their parents had explained that part of the savings would help him with tuition and housing. He had assumed the rest was meant for Emily when her turn came. For a moment neither of them spoke. Then Emily asked the question that had been waiting behind every other thought since the dinner table conversation. She asked Jason if he knew how much money had been in that account. Jason answered without hesitation. He said the last time their father mentioned it, the balance was close to $187,000. Emily closed her eyes as the number settled into her mind. $187,000. That was more than enough to pay for the 4 years she had spent working part-time and signing loan documents she believed were her only option. When Jason asked why she sounded so quiet, Emily simply said she needed to look into something. She ended the call and set the phone down slowly on the table. In that moment, Emily Carter realized that the story she had accepted about her own future had never been the full truth. And somewhere within her family, the real explanation was waiting to be uncovered. Emily Carter spent the rest of that morning sitting at the same kitchen table where she had ended the call with her brother, staring at the blank screen of her laptop while the number Jason had mentioned repeated itself in her mind. $187,000. The amount felt unreal, not because it was impossible, but because it represented something far larger than money. It represented years of choices that had shaped the direction of her life. Emily slowly opened a new browser window and began searching for basic information about college savings accounts. The process was straightforward. Parents or relatives could open accounts years before a child even finished elementary school, depositing money over time so that when the child reached college age the funds would be ready. It was a common practice across the United States. Families who planned ahead often used these accounts to give their children a chance to start adulthood without the burden of heavy loans. Emily leaned back in her chair and thought about the years she had spent believing her family simply could not afford something like that. She remembered the afternoon she had received her university acceptance letter. Her parents had congratulated her warmly, but quickly shifted the conversation toward financial aid forms and student loan applications. They had told her that education was an investment and that responsible adults learned to manage debt carefully. At the time, Emily had nodded and filled out the paperwork without hesitation. She had trusted their explanation because she had never imagined there was another possibility. As the morning passed, memories continued surfacing one after another. She remembered visiting home during her sophomore year of college and hearing her parents talk quietly in the living room about tuition payments. She had assumed they were discussing Jason's final semester expenses. Now she wondered if that conversation had been about something else entirely. Emily stood and began pacing slowly across the small apartment living room. The space measured barely 600 square feet, with a narrow hallway leading to the bedroom and a tiny balcony overlooking the parking lot. It was comfortable enough for one person, but it was far from the life she once imagined when she was younger. The monthly rent was manageable only because she kept strict control over every other expense. She drove a 10-year-old sedan with more than 120,000 miles on the odometer. Her vacations consisted of short weekend visits with friends rather than flights across the country. None of those choices had ever bothered her before. She had accepted them as normal steps toward building a stable future. But now the quiet balance of that life felt different. Because if the college fund Jason described had existed, then the financial path Emily had followed might not have been necessary at all. She stopped near the bookshelf beside the couch and noticed an old framed photograph that had been sitting there for years. It showed Emily and her grandmother Margaret Carter standing together at a community garden fair when Emily was in high school. Margaret had always been a steady presence in Emily's life. She was a retired school librarian who lived about 40 minutes outside the city in a small house surrounded by maple trees. Emily remembered spending many afternoons there growing up, helping Margaret plant vegetables in the backyard or listening to stories about the town's history. Margaret believed strongly in education. She often said that knowledge gave people the freedom to choose their own path in life. Emily suddenly remembered something else Margaret used to say. Whenever the topic of college came up, Margaret would smile and say that Emily's future had been carefully planned long before she realized it. At the time, Emily had thought it was simply an encouraging phrase adults used when speaking to young students. But now the words felt strangely precise. Carefully planned. Emily picked up her phone again and looked at Margaret's contact information on the screen. If anyone in the family might know the full story about the account Jason had mentioned, it would be her grandmother. Margaret Carter had always paid attention to details that others overlooked. And if a college fund had been created years ago in Emily's name, Margaret might know exactly where that money had come from and where it had eventually gone. Emily Carter stared at her grandmother Margaret Carter's contact on her phone for several long seconds before finally pressing the call button. The phone rang slowly, the soft electronic tone echoing in the quiet apartment. When Margaret answered, her voice carried the calm warmth Emily had known since childhood. Margaret asked how work was going and whether Emily had been taking care of herself. For a moment, Emily almost forgot why she had called. But the question that had been growing inside her all morning could not remain unspoken any longer. Emily explained that something confusing had come up during dinner the previous night. She mentioned Jason's comment about a college fund and the amount he believed had once been in the account. There was a pause on the other end of the line. It was not the kind of silence that came from confusion. It sounded more like someone quietly deciding how much truth needed to be said. Margaret finally spoke again, but her tone had changed slightly. She asked Emily to repeat the number Jason had mentioned. Emily answered carefully. $187,000. Margaret exhaled slowly. She said that the number sounded accurate, although she had not looked at the account records in several years. Emily felt her heartbeat quicken. The fact that Margaret did not sound surprised told her everything she needed to know. The account had been real. It had existed exactly the way Jason described. Emily asked her grandmother when the account had been opened. Margaret explained that it had been created when Emily was about 5 years old. At that time, Margaret had decided to start a long-term education savings plan for her granddaughter. She had made the first deposit herself and encouraged Robert and Linda to contribute whenever they could. Over the years, the account slowly grew through regular deposits and careful investments. Margaret said she always believed that by the time Emily finished high school, there would be enough to give her a strong start in college. Emily listened without interrupting. Each sentence felt like another piece of a puzzle that had been hidden from her for most of her life. Finally, she asked the question that mattered more than anything else. She asked Margaret what had happened to the money. Margaret hesitated again. When she spoke this time, her voice carried a quiet disappointment that Emily had rarely heard before. She said that several years earlier, Robert had contacted her to explain that the family needed to adjust their plans. Jason had been accepted into a private engineering program with very high tuition costs. Robert had assured Margaret that the education fund would still benefit both children in the long run, but that the immediate priority had to be Jason's tuition and housing expenses. Margaret said she had trusted Robert's explanation at the time. She believed he would find a way to restore the balance before Emily reached college age. But as the years passed, she noticed that the account activity had gradually slowed and eventually stopped entirely. Emily stood quietly in her kitchen while Margaret spoke. The apartment around her felt very still. Outside the window, a car passed through the parking lot, its tires crunching lightly on gravel. Margaret eventually added something that made the situation even clearer. She said that by the time Emily graduated from high school, the education account had already been nearly empty. Most of the funds had been used to support Jason's university expenses. Emily closed her eyes as the final pieces of the story settled into place. The loans she had signed, the long hours working during college, the constant effort to manage every expense had all been built on a misunderstanding she had never questioned. When Margaret asked softly whether Robert and Linda had ever explained the situation to her, Emily answered honestly. She said no one had ever told her anything at all. The silence that followed was heavier than the one at the dinner table the night before. Because now the truth had finally been spoken out loud. Emily Carter remained standing in her quiet kitchen long after the call with her grandmother Margaret Carter ended, her phone still resting in her hand as if the conversation might somehow continue. The information Margaret had shared felt clear and undeniable. The education fund had existed. It had been built slowly over many years with the intention of supporting Emily's future. And yet the money had been redirected long before she ever filled out her first college application. Emily walked slowly toward the living room window and looked out across the parking lot where the afternoon light had begun to soften the edges of the surrounding buildings. Everything outside appeared ordinary, but inside her thoughts were shifting in ways she had never expected. For most of her life, Emily had believed that the financial challenges she faced during college were simply part of growing up. She had accepted the long hours working part-time at restaurants and retail stores. She had accepted the pressure of balancing coursework with evening shifts and early morning classes. And she had accepted the student loan balance that followed her after graduation because she believed there had never been another option. Now she understood that there had been another path available all along, one that had quietly disappeared without anyone explaining why. Emily walked back to the kitchen table and sat down again, trying to sort through the emotions rising inside her. Surprisingly, anger was not the first feeling that surfaced. Instead, there was a deep sense of confusion. Her parents had always taught her to value honesty and responsibility. They had encouraged her to work hard and trust that effort would eventually create opportunity. Those lessons had shaped the way Emily approached every challenge in her life. But now she could not reconcile those values with the decision that had been made about the education fund. Margaret had believed the money would support Emily's future. Robert and Linda had chosen to use most of it for Jason's university expenses instead. Perhaps they believed they were making the best choice for the family at the time. Perhaps they believed Emily would eventually manage on her own. But what troubled her most was not the decision itself. It was the silence that followed it. Years had passed without a single conversation explaining what had happened. Emily had signed loan agreements, worked extra hours, and adjusted her plans for the future without ever knowing the full story behind those choices. As the afternoon continued, Emily began reviewing the timeline in her mind. Jason had started college nearly 5 years before she graduated from high school. If the education fund had been used to support his tuition, then the account must have been nearly empty by the time Emily began applying to universities. That explained why her parents had focused immediately on loans and scholarships during those discussions. They had already made their decision long before she ever realized a decision existed. Emily reached for a notebook on the table and began writing down the key details she now knew. The account had been opened when she was about 5 years old. The balance had eventually reached approximately $187,000. Most of the funds had been withdrawn during Jason's years in college. And at no point during that process had anyone told Emily the truth. The act of writing the information helped organize her thoughts, turning vague suspicions into clear facts. When she finished, Emily looked at the page for several seconds. Then she realized something important. Her grandmother had trusted Robert to manage the account responsibly. Margaret believed the money would benefit both grandchildren in some fair and thoughtful way. But Margaret had never been told that Emily entered adulthood carrying tens of thousands of dollars in student loan debt. Emily closed the notebook gently and looked toward her phone again. The story that had quietly shaped her life for years was no longer hidden. And if her grandmother truly understood how the situation had unfolded, Emily suspected Margaret Carter might have more to say about it. Emily Carter did not call her grandmother again that evening, but she knew Margaret Carter would be thinking about the conversation they had just shared. Margaret had always been someone who believed in fairness, sometimes to a fault. When Emily was younger, she remembered her grandmother carefully dividing slices of pie so that every grandchild received exactly the same portion. Margaret believed small details revealed a person's character, and fairness was never something she treated lightly. That evening, Emily tried to return to her normal routine. She prepared a simple dinner, answered a few work emails, and attempted to focus on a report she needed to finish for the marketing firm where she worked. But her thoughts kept drifting back to the same realization. For years, she had believed her parents simply could not afford to help with her education. Now she knew the truth was far more complicated than that. Across town, in her quiet house surrounded by maple trees, Margaret Carter sat at her kitchen table with a small notebook open, beside a cup of tea. The conversation with Emily had unsettled her in a way she had not expected. Margaret had always trusted her son Robert to handle family responsibilities carefully. When he told her years earlier that the education savings plan would temporarily support Jason's tuition, she believed the arrangement would eventually balance itself. But Emily's voice on the phone that afternoon had made something very clear. The balance had never been restored. Margaret slowly opened a drawer in the sideboard next to the kitchen table and removed a thin folder filled with old financial statements. She had kept copies of the early account documents from when the education fund was first created. Margaret believed records mattered. They told the story of decisions that people sometimes forgot over time. She adjusted her reading glasses and began reviewing the papers carefully. The first document showed the original deposits she made when Emily was 5 years old. Another page listed contributions Robert and Linda added during the following years. Margaret could see the steady growth of the account through careful investments. By the time Emily reached middle school, the balance had already passed $70,000. Margaret turned another page and noticed the withdrawal activity that began several years later. The pattern was gradual but unmistakable. Tuition payments, housing deposits, and other educational expenses connected to Jason's university appeared again and again. Margaret remembered those years clearly now. Jason had been accepted into a respected engineering program, and the family was proud of his achievement. Supporting his education had felt like a responsible choice at the time. But what Margaret had not realized was how completely the account had been drained before Emily ever reached college age. She set the papers down and looked toward the kitchen window, where the evening sky was beginning to darken behind the tall maple trees. Margaret Carter had spent more than 30 years working as a school librarian. She had watched hundreds of students pass through those halls, each one carrying different dreams about their future. One lesson she believed deeply was that opportunity should never depend on silence or misunderstanding. If something important had been taken from Emily without explanation, then that truth deserved to be addressed openly. Margaret closed the folder and rested her hands on top of it. She did not feel angry in the loud, dramatic way people sometimes described anger. Instead, she felt something quieter and far more deliberate. She believed families could make mistakes, but those mistakes needed to be acknowledged before they could ever be corrected. Emily Carter had spent years building her life under the assumption that no one had been able to help her. Now Margaret knew that assumption had never been accurate. And Margaret Carter had never been the kind of person who ignored a problem once she understood the full story. The following morning, Margaret Carter woke earlier than usual, long before the quiet neighborhood around her small house began to stir. The maple trees outside her window were still, and the early sunlight stretched softly across the kitchen floor. She moved slowly through her morning routine, brewing coffee and placing the familiar ceramic mug beside the folder of documents she had reviewed the night before. The papers remained exactly where she had left them on the table, neatly arranged and impossible to misunderstand. Margaret had spent decades believing that careful planning could help protect a young person's future. That belief had guided her decision when she first opened the education savings account for Emily all those years ago. She had imagined that the money would eventually give her granddaughter freedom to choose a path without financial pressure. Now she understood that the plan had quietly shifted without anyone explaining the change to the one person it had been meant to help. Margaret sat down at the table again and opened the folder once more. She studied the timeline with the patience of someone who had spent years working among books and records. The deposits, the withdrawals, the tuition payments tied to Jason's university. Every line told part of the story. None of it looked accidental. Yet what troubled her most was not the money itself. It was the silence that followed those decisions. Emily had entered adulthood believing the family simply did not have resources to support her education. That belief had shaped every choice she made afterward. Margaret reached for the telephone beside the kitchen wall and dialed her son Robert's number. It rang several times before he answered, his voice slightly distracted as if he had just stepped away from work. Margaret greeted him calmly and asked if he had a few minutes to talk. Robert responded politely, although he sounded cautious the moment Margaret mentioned the education fund. Margaret did not accuse him of anything. She simply explained that she had spoken with Emily and that certain details about the account no longer matched the explanation she had been given years earlier. Robert tried to respond carefully, saying that supporting Jason's engineering program had been a complicated financial decision at the time. Margaret listened without interrupting, but when he finished she asked a question that left little room for misunderstanding. She asked why Emily had never been told the truth about the account. There was a pause on the line. Robert finally admitted that he and Linda believed discussing the situation would only create unnecessary conflict between the siblings. They hoped Emily would eventually build her own success without feeling compared to Jason. Margaret thanked him for his honesty, but reminded him gently that avoiding a difficult conversation often created a deeper problem later. After the call ended, Margaret remained seated at the table for several minutes. She was not interested in arguments or dramatic confrontations. But she believed strongly that silence should never be allowed to rewrite the history of a decision that affected someone's future so directly. Later that afternoon she called Emily again and asked if she would be willing to visit her house that weekend. Margaret said there were several documents she wanted Emily to see for herself. When Emily agreed, Margaret closed the folder and placed it neatly back into the drawer beside the table. The story that had remained hidden for years was now fully visible on paper. And Margaret Carter believed that once the truth was clearly understood, the family would have to face it together. Emily Carter arrived at her grandmother Margaret Carter's house on Saturday afternoon, just as the early autumn sunlight filtered through the tall maple trees that surrounded the quiet property. The familiar gravel driveway crunched softly beneath her tires as she parked her car and stepped out into the cool air. She had visited this house countless times while growing up, yet today everything felt slightly different, as if the place itself understood that an important conversation was waiting inside. Margaret opened the front door before Emily even reached the steps, greeting her with the same calm smile she had always worn, but Emily could see a quiet seriousness in her grandmother's eyes. They walked together into the kitchen where the same wooden table Margaret had used for decades stood near the window. On the table rested the folder of documents Margaret had mentioned on the phone. Emily sat down while Margaret placed 2 cups of tea beside the papers and gently slid the folder across the table. Inside were the original account statements, neatly organized and dated. Emily began reading them carefully, following the timeline that Margaret had already described. The early deposits, the steady growth of the account, and then the withdrawals that gradually shifted the balance toward Jason's tuition expenses. Seeing the numbers written clearly on paper made the situation feel real in a way that no conversation ever could. When Emily finished reading, she looked up slowly. Margaret did not rush to speak. She allowed the silence to settle naturally before explaining one final detail. She told Emily that after reviewing the records and speaking with Robert, she had decided something important needed to be corrected. Years earlier, Margaret had set aside a separate investment account for her own retirement savings. She had never planned to use that money for anything other than her later years, but circumstances sometimes required a different choice. Margaret explained that she had already spoken with her financial advisor earlier that week. She intended to transfer a portion of that account into a new education and debt relief fund under Emily's name. The amount would not perfectly replace the original $187,000, but it would be enough to significantly reduce the student loans Emily had been carrying since graduation. Emily felt a sudden wave of emotion rise in her chest, but Margaret gently raised her hand before she could speak. Margaret explained that this decision was not meant as a punishment for anyone else in the family. It was simply a way to restore the balance that had quietly disappeared years ago. Later that evening, Robert and Linda arrived at the house after Margaret invited them to join the conversation. The discussion was calm but honest. Margaret placed the documents on the table and explained everything clearly so that no part of the story remained hidden anymore. Robert eventually admitted that avoiding the conversation years earlier had been a mistake. Jason, who had joined the call from Cleveland, listened quietly and expressed regret that he had never realized how the situation had affected his sister. By the time the evening ended, the tension that had built around the hidden account finally began to fade. Emily Carter drove back to her apartment that night with a feeling she had not experienced since the dinner that started everything. The past could not be rewritten, and the years she had spent working and managing debt would always remain part of her story. But now the truth had been acknowledged openly, and the balance her grandmother believed in had finally been restored.